Well, good day, and thank you for joining us here on this webinar. I know that we are in a weird time of the year, weirder than ever in this 2020. Many of us are finishing the school year. If you went to school until June, some of you are in the middle of the summer now. If you finished in May, and some of us feel like maybe we've been done if we go all the way back to March 17th. But today we're going to talk about going forward. And we're going to talk about some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves, whether we're leaders, whether we're teachers, whether we're school designers or consultants. What are some of the things we should be considering? I mean, I know a lot of the oxygen in the room has been consumed by things like how do we keep desks 6 feet apart, and how do we get kids safely to school, and how do we feed kids? All of that super essential. But we can't forget about the learning piece. And I think that's where I want to focus today as we think about kind of the 9 key concepts of coming back in the fall. The other thing is that I get a chance to work with a lot of school districts around the country. And I just know that school leaders are working really hard to try to come up with the right answers. I also know that sometimes teachers are involved with those decisions, sometimes they're not. Just encouragement to all the school leaders out there to continue to ask for teacher voice, continue to ask for community voice, and then just make your best decisions. We are not ever going to have certainty before we return to school. So let's put our best plan forward and then be agile enough to kind of pivot as we need to. Thanks again to our friends at Demco for hosting this webinar and bringing people together. I think that's what I appreciate most about Demco is their commitment to bringing people together in conversation so that where kids learn is optimized, but also what they're learning and how they're learning. And so I thank them for having me and thank them for bringing you together for this conversation today. If you'd like to tweet about what's going on today, you can see right there, hashtag Demco Ideas. Actually, a lot of great stuff over there. It's worth going and just looking at that hashtag and seeing what's there. Certainly there's some product there, but I think there's a lot of just great ideas for teachers and for leaders as they return in the fall. A little bit about my background. I am a high school English teacher, middle school principal, chief technology officer, and now I have this role of school designer. And I've been doing that work in the St. Louis area and around the country for the last 25 years. I put my email right there for a reason. I want to make sure that if you have a question, if you have something that comes up, if I mention something and I seem to rush by it, please reach out to me. I am very good, and everyone will tell you about returning emails and getting back to people. I feel like a big part of my role is, since I do get to see so many schools and so many best practices around the country, is to share back and to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to know about best practices and know about all the good stuff that's going on. So if you have a question about something, encourage you to email me and then use that hashtag so that we can all be in conversation. One of the things that I'm concerned about, but I remain optimistic because at our core as educators, we know that schools have to be very humane places. That means kids have to enjoy being there. Adults have to be safe there. We have to have places where it's just comfortable to gather. And I think that's a big push in my work around learning space design. But I also think that as we talk about these 9 concepts going forward, that it's really important that we continue to think about not just healthy spaces. And I know that in this global pandemic, it's important that we think about healthy spaces, including, where do we section things off and how do we think about traffic patterns and how many kids are in a classroom and how many kids interact with how many other teachers on a given basis. Lots of important questions. And I know that everyone wants schools to be a healthy place, not only physically, but also social emotionally. But I would just encourage us to use these guideposts, that we need schools that are not only healthy, but humane. I have 2 daughters, and the last thing that I want to hear when they go back to school is, Dad, I can't stand the fact that I have to sit in the same seat for 6.5 hours a day, and I can't move. They bring my lunch to me. I don't get to go anywhere. I don't want to be at school. And I'm really worried that many of our students are going to come away with that impression. But we can, if we think about these 9 concepts we're going to go into today, continue to think about not only healthy spaces, but humane spaces. And I think they're just a great way to start all of our meetings and all of our conversations. So remember the importance of both of those. What else makes up a humane space? I think first and foremost, students need to be engaged. And I didn't use the word entertained. Very different, but I think important that we continue to think about how can we engage kids across platforms. We're going to have times where schools are closed because someone gets sick or a community doesn't feel comfortable with school being in session. How do we keep kids engaged in that virtual environment or in a blended environment where some schools are now saying, hey, we're going to have kids come 2 days a week. They're going to be home 2 days a week. I think that's some of our biggest challenges. How do we continue to take what we know to be good engagement strategies, kids collaborating, kids doing things that are relevant, kids that are doing things that are exciting, kids being outside, kids interacting with things. How do we take them across the in-person to the blended to the virtual and keep that engagement going? We'll talk about some of that as we talk about these 9 concepts as well. And when I talk about humane schools, I really want kids to feel a sense of joy. There is a deep joy in my heart every time I get to learn something. I pick up a book, I read something, I read an email, I read a news story. I feel like that insight, that new knowledge is a deep sense of joy for me. And I want that to be passed on to the generation of students that are in school now. How can we give knowledge, help them discover knowledge, construct knowledge in a way that learning becomes a joyful experience? Sometimes filling out reading logs and doing math facts doesn't fit into joyful. But on the totality, how do we make sure as we think about these 9 concepts that we're thinking about ways to continue to make school where it's engaging and joyful? A lot of my work stems from some things that I've put in print. The upcoming book, The Space, A Guide for School Leaders, is coming soon. And so that goes along as a companion piece to The Space, A Guide for Educators. Another thing that worth noting, and I think that we need a horizon. So much of the uncertainty of right now is this piece around, will this ever be over? When will we have a vaccine? When will we have an opportunity to go back to normal? My feeling is that we're never going back to where we were. I hope we go back to a better version of where we were. But over the next 6 to 9 months, I think it's going to be really important for us to realize that there's just going to be a lot of things that we have to endure over this first semester, maybe over this full school year. And in that time, there's going to be a lot of urgent things. I may have to eat in my classroom. I may have to supervise differently. I may have to arrive at school differently. I may have to fill out paperwork. I may have to have my temperature checked. I may have to wear a mask. But I honestly believe that some of those things that are right now urgently in our hearts and things that are definitely in a place that we are worried about and nervous about and fearful about, and some of us are saying, can we go back to work in a healthy way? I hope and I believe that the horizon on that is 6 to 9 months. And if we can see that, we say, okay, in 180 days, that's 6 months. In 200 days, I can get back to doing the business of how I do school in an amazing way for kids. So that's why in today's webinar, I'm really sticking to a lot of things that I think are significant. That if we think about them now, we can not only use them for 6 to 9 months in this very urgent moment, in this pandemic, but we can use them to make a better new normal as opposed to going back to the normal. And I think that schools that are doing this right, districts that are doing this right, are thinking beyond the urgent. They're thinking about the urgent, but they're also thinking about things that are significant. And these 9 elements that we talk about today really do get to things that maybe we should have been talking about 5 years ago. Maybe we should have been in a place where we were dealing with those, but they got put on the back burner. So these 9 key concepts aren't specific to the pandemic, but they are things that if we deal with right now, that our new normal going forward has a real chance to be something that's impactful and powerful in ways that our old system fell short. And we know that our old system has fallen short. There are some kids that are invisible and marginalized, their voice isn't heard, their personal needs aren't being met, social emotionally they're being not tended to the best way they could have. And it's not because we don't care or we don't want to. It's usually because the system is inhibiting that. So hopefully these 9 areas that we talk about will lead to some greater conversations. And I know that everyone on here doesn't have control of your whole system. But I do believe that a teacher, a school leader, an assistant principal, a teacher's aide has a sphere of influence. And that's what I'm asking, I think, at the end of this, is to find 1 or 2 of these key concepts and begin to think about, hey, how in my sphere of influence, my team, my grade level, my department, how can I begin to have some conversations so that when we do emerge on the backside of this pandemic learning, that we can really have an impactful type of school for all kids in new ways. So here's number 1. It's about communication. About 2 years ago, I wrote a book about powerful parent partnerships. I thought it was the last piece of the puzzle for me. I put together something on instructional practices and the power of project-based learning and experiential learning. I had written about the impact of technology used correctly. I had written about where students learn matters. And we know the importance of learning environments. And the last piece was, how do we continue to rewrite the playbook around how we communicate with our families? I think this is important. We're in a time and place where there's a lot of noise, whether it's the stress of poverty, whether it's fear from the pandemic, whether it's a bunch of mixed messages about what it means to be healthy. How should I wear my mask? Should I wear a mask? Yes, you should. And there are right ways to wear those masks. But amongst that, schools have to get their message through. And then teachers have to get their message through. And some of you have done this beautifully. We see programs like people using Seesaw and portfolio-based and video and photos to tell their story about what's going on in the classroom. And I would just encourage that we need to continue to think about how we get our message clearly, concisely, and consistently to our families. I think that is really important in this day and age where it's really noisy all around us. So how do we personalize those messages? And how do we personalize the media that go along with that? Have you asked recently to your parents, what's the best way for me to contact you? Is it text message? Is it email? Because I know a lot of folks that are just sending out emails, using Remind, and not really saying, you know what, for this group of parents, I need to send a text message. For this group of parents, I need to send an email. And some people are saying, I'm just going to send it on all the channels and hope it sticks. And I would just encourage, as we think about communication strategy, that it's important that we are able to continue to use the right media for our families as we go forward, especially in this time. Because now more than ever, when kids are there some days and not other days, when we're assigning things on platforms, it's important that we continue to think about our communication strategy. And I use that word strategy on purpose. Most schools kind of take a tact of we're going to push information out. And sometimes it falls short because we're not creating feedback loops where people are giving us information back. So as we go forward in this urgent time, in this significant time, how do we retransform? How do we just transform the way that we communicate with our families? It's an important piece now, and it'll be an important piece going forward because we are in a day and age where we're bombarded by messaging. So what does that mean? I would say that there are now more opportunities than ever. Do you have folks that are using TikTok videos? Do you have folks that are podcasting? Do you have people that are using platforms like LinkedIn? I would say I've seen teachers and leaders use lots of platforms to reach their audiences, but to realize that there are lots of audiences as well. Not only are you reaching out to your families, but how does your community know about what's going on in your classroom? How do we continue to make sure that the amazing things that you're doing in this time are getting appreciated, noticed, and seen by everyone within the district and beyond? I think it's an important question. It never goes away as something, but in this time right now, thinking about communication strategy is really important as we go forward. Number 2. So we talked about communication strategy and its importance. What we found over the last few months is this around the country, is that taking away all of our grading practices in a hurry, without explanation, without thought, has been detrimental to our students. Let me give you a couple examples. A friend of mine that teaches chemistry, and in his school district, they said, hey, as of March 17th, when they left school for the final time, you're held harmless. Your grade can't go down based on the rest of the year. My friend who's a chemistry teacher said, I had 3 kids who have Bs that said, I'm good with my B, have a great summer. We can't set ourselves up to be in a situation where our grading practices deter kids from learning more often, and longer. And I think that traditional grading practices did that. Emergency grading practices did that. And so we have a lot of districts around the country that are talking about, how can I do grading differently? Now, I'm not sure that pass-fail is enough of a motivator. And let me talk about why. I think for over the years, we've had a lot of teaching kids how to be point collectors. How do I get a B? I need 4 more points so I can get a B. If you've been in a classroom, you've heard these conversations with kids, the bartering about how do I go from a C to a B? And you say things like, well, you need to learn the material. But the honest answer is you have to collect more points. We went from point collecting and grading practices that weren't internally motivating to just ripping all of those away in many cases. So I would just encourage that as we go back, it is worthy and time for a conversation about our grading practices. I think it's going to be important to say, how do we continue to be fair, equitable, in a time when some kids have access to technology, some kids have limited access, some kids have minimal access, to continue to be fair about our grading practices, at the same time, not ripping away the motivation to actually do the work, stay on track in doing what we're doing. So what are some of these modern kind of motivating measures that we can use? And there's my 2 daughters a few years ago. One of them needs no motivation. She'll get work done there on the right. If you just say, hey, let's go learn this, she'll do it. Then my daughter on the left, she wants to know why. She wants to have explanation. She wants to know in deep ways about what's going on and why it matters to do this. And so every kid's a little different. My hope is, though, we can start to use things like conferencing, conversation, reflection video as ways to get feedback from kids. Most of my middle school students, when I was a middle school principal, could tell you what they were currently earning in their class. Not how many points they had, not what their percentage was, not what their letter grade was, but what they truly deserved. And I think we have to extend in this time an opportunity for kids to be a little more self-reflective, a little bit more about naming their grades as a piece of the puzzle. The other piece that I think might be important is this. Some schools are moving to a system that's a little more like A, B, C, or incomplete. And I think it's my favorite system right now. And you can push back and you can email me and say, hey, that doesn't work because. But here's what I like, is that it keeps the top end of the scale. It keeps kids saying, I want an A, I want a B, I want a C, I'm going to keep moving towards those. But it takes the bottom end of the scale off. What we've noticed over time is that if you're point collecting and that you can't turn something in or points are taken off because it's late, all of a sudden kids become very demotivated about grades. And if we just say, hey, it's incomplete, I don't have enough data to know what your grade is, that can be a powerful motivator for some kids. Now, are there going to be a group of kids, 5, 10% of kids, that no matter what system you set up doesn't work? Probably. But as you think, not only about how to communicate with families, but how to grade, please continue to consider that there are a lot of systemic limitations to kids being successful in these new models that we're creating. Heck, there's a lot of limitations for teachers to be successful in these models that we're creating. So take the bottom end of the scale out of the equation. Build on the top end of the scale, and then work on the motivation to get kids from the top to the bottom, or from the bottom to the top. I think it's a really important thing. So think about your grading practices. Please don't go back into your space after not being there maybe since March and say, you know what, I'm going to grade the same way I graded before. Thoughtful, intentional grading practices are going to help these systems work or not work going forward. So 2 key concepts: communication strategy and grading, that we should be thinking differently as we go back for whatever this looks like in the fall. Number 3. So the third concept here is about experiential learning. One of the things I think fell short for many schools, and not to anyone's fault, was that school that became emergency remote learning kind of went to the lowest common denominator in a lot of places. Maybe not in your classroom, maybe not every day, but we saw a lot of, hey, read this, respond to this. Read this, respond to this. Watch this video, give this reflection. That is learning. But at some point in time, it's not joyful learning. It's not engaging learning. And maybe it doesn't become humane learning after a while. And I'm worried that our blended model, as we return, might have these amazing moments of conversation in the classroom for the 2 days a week that students are there. But if we have kids at home continuing to do learning, we have to think a little bit different about how we build that learning. How do we create experiences for kids while they're at home, whether that's for a week, whether that's they're sick, a family member's sick, they can't come to school, the school got closed, whatever that is. How do we make sure that those moments don't digress to the bottom of learning, but they can be really amazing experiences? So I would just ask that you consider these 3 verbs, right? There are 3 verbs that I think really drive experiential learning. How in my lesson today are kids discovering something new? How are they looking for things that are exciting to them? How are they discovering learning and getting excited and being joyful about their learning? How am I allowing students to explore? Right? Maybe everything's not prescripted. Do this, then do this, then do this, then you're done for the day. Maybe we're saying, hey, I want you to go explore some concepts. I want you to go do this simulation. I want you to try this thing. There are some amazing technology tools that allow kids to explore. And so how do we incorporate some of those into our learning as well? And then finally, how do we use our surroundings? No matter if you live in poverty, you live in amazing wealth and privilege, there are things around you that you can notice. And I think noticing builds curiosity. Noticing slows your brain down and takes you off of the screen to look around. Think that how can we continue to build these 3 verbs of discover, explore, and notice? I would just encourage, as you're filling out a lesson, as you're trying to figure out your week's plan, write those at the top as like, I want to make sure these things happen at some point in time for my kids this week. I think that's an important thing to move us towards experiential learning. And the other piece is, we know that one of the biggest gaps that our kids have is this experience gap. There are kids that since March have been at home in a small 1-bedroom apartment with 5 people in them. There are kids that I work with that have been in a situation where they've lived in a hotel for 2 months. And there's other families that have said, oh, we're just going to take our show on the road. We're going to go to the mountains for a month and we're going to explore. Or, hey, we're going to go and just live at our other house. Those kids are getting a totally different type of experience. So as we have more time away from our classroom, the experience gap continues to explode. We can't fill the entire thing. We can't solve all of that problem. But if our units and our lessons and the things that we're having kids do in front of their screens don't feel like an experience at all, then we are kind of being a part of that experience gap problem as opposed to the experience gap solution. So I would encourage you to think about communication strategy and grading, but also how do we change the type of learning that we're asking kids to do on their computers or at home, trying to make it more experiential. Not every day, not every moment, but adding that to the mix at a deeper level will go a long way to what we're trying to do in this kind of critical, urgent moment that we're all kind of feeling like we're stuck in. All right, so number 4. How are we designing engaging lessons? This goes back, this kind of ties some of these things together. Maybe it's those verbs. Hey, I'm remembering those verbs. Maybe it's the fact that we're saying, you know what, I get that in order to have healthy and humane spaces for learning, that means engagement and joy. And sometimes it's just reminding ourselves that it's on us to build opportunities for kids to be engaged in what's going on. And I think first and foremost, it's finding relevance. Our students are natural problem solvers. All of our students have natural curiosity. All of our students can be creative. We have to allow for them to have moments to do those sorts of things. Again, a playlist, a recipe for learning rarely has that deep amount of relevance going on. I hope that as we think about both synchronous time and asynchronous time with our kids, that we're asking them questions like, what problem do you want to solve? What is going on in your community that you can be a solution for? Helping kids in the moment right now deal with some of the things that are going on in our society. Social justice issues, economic justice issues, environmental justice issues, including the kind of safe, healthy environment. Having our kids help to solve the problems of our schools and how we design them, how we work through a situation, distributing lunch and getting kids on and off of buses and making sure kids enter our buildings in healthy ways. Our kids could dig into those problems and probably come up with better solutions than we can as adults. So how, as you're crafting your lesson design, can you give kids some space to do some things that are relevant to them? I think for the last month and a half, I've had to experience my daughter watching over and over episodes of the Gilmore Girls. Yeah, it's brought the IQ of the entire house down a little bit, but I know when she breaks away from that and does something that matters to her, she gets in that flow state, even in our house, even if it's not about school. So I know that if we can allow kids some space to do something relevant with some guideposts, tell us about it, reflect on it, have some outcomes from it, share it out to a larger audience, that can go a long way to having kids do relevant things as we go. Then I also think it's important that great conversation is an important part of engagement. And that's hard to do when you have a group of faces on a screen. When you have a bunch of folks that you need to get some message to, but you want to listen. But I would encourage you to use things like the back channel and the chat in your video calls, making sure that you use things like breakout rooms and letting 2s and 3s go and have conversations and come back together. But just making sure that if you want engaging lesson design, that part of that's about conversation and part of that's about relevance. Because I think sometimes when we have a blended learning environment or a virtual learning environment or whatever adjective you want to put in front of that, one of the things that gets sacrificed is this sense that we can lose engagement. So how do we encourage conversation? How do we encourage relevance? I think those are 2 really big questions to have with your colleagues. And if I would encourage you to take anything away, take those 2 questions. You can control grades and you control communication, but as a group, how can we think about conversation and how we do that across platforms and media? And how do we do that with relevance? And I put that smack dab in our 9 here because I think it's maybe one of the more important ones to talk about. Hey, number 5 is how do we build community remotely? I've heard a couple people say, hey, always we got to have Maslow before Bloom's, right? Before the learning, we've got to have the social emotional piece of what's going on. And I do think that now more than ever, we have to think about the social emotional needs of our students. Many of our students' mental health has digressed over the last few months. Many of our students have become more anxious, depressed, lonely, and isolated. And part of our role as we return to school, and I would say as we return for a period of days, not like, hey, for an hour, how are we building community? We were lucky in March. In March, we had built-in relationships with a group of kids. Now, I know some schools are saying, hey, we're going to loop so that we make sure that kids stay with the same teacher, they know each other, they know what's going on. And where that's available, I think that's a good idea. But where it's not available, and I think of things like high school or middle school where, teachers have 150 new kids. And the only way they get to relate to them is a couple days a week in their school, or maybe, they have to travel around from room to room to be with kids, or they're doing that through Zoom or Google Meet. That idea of community is really important. So when you're in this kind of virtual environment, how do you create a classroom culture? I would say a couple of things. Make sure that kids know where you are and you're open to telling your story and being real, not like, hey, I'm having a great morning and all is good, and being that. Like, it might be like, hey, I'm struggling this morning. I didn't have enough coffee yet. Hey, things were a little crazy around my house over the weekend. You know what? I'm just kind of sad that I can't be with you today. Like, all of those statements about your story and where you are allows for people to open up in different ways. Also, where it's available, office hours, where you can meet one-on-one, where you can meet one-on-two safely, securely, re-recorded if you need to. All of those things matter. So however you can get smaller groups together, because just like there are introverts in a classroom setting, there are introverts in a virtual classroom environment. I find myself on that category. When I'm in a big Zoom call with 30 people, I don't want to say much. Now, I'm the first person, and we're all in a room together, that I want to talk. So don't think it's the same kids that are always in those two groups. Sometimes your virtual introverts are different than your in-person introverts. So being thoughtful about, how do I build culture? How do I build community? You could have some contests. You could tell some stories. You could do some fun things. You could play some games. All of those things will matter, because if you don't do those things, all of the learning that you're pouring on the kids, that you feel an urgency and you're like, I don't have enough time to do all this, none of that stuff's going to stick. You're going to have kids that are like Teflon, that it just feels like all the learning just keeps rolling off of them. Culture is the Velcro for learning. And so how do you do that? How do you continue to think about that? How can you say that's not a checkbox like I did culture, that you're continuing to do that over the course of this urgent time in a pandemic where we're in a different model on every week, every day, everything's changing all of the time. And then asking yourself this question, how can we best spend our synchronous time? So being really thoughtful, and I think we learned a lot in March and April and May and June, where we learned what is the best use of our synchronous time versus our asynchronous time. Asynchronous time, let's get some things done. Let's read. Let's take care of these things. Maybe check in and send an email if you need something. But while you have your synchronous time, let's make sure people are clear about what their expectations are. Let's check in with people. Let's build culture and community. Let's make sure that we use our synchronous time not just for our voice, because we can record our voice and send it to kids so that they can watch it whenever they want during their asynchronous time. Use it to build culture, community, connection, and push back against the forces that are really going at the social emotional needs of our kids. So that would be my encouragement, is to rethink our synchronous time, not for our voice, but for the health and well-being of our kids as we go. All right, let's talk about this one. Maximizing community partnerships. Some people go, oh, like this feels like a school, a district level one. But what I would say is that the best teachers that I know are building their own set of community partnerships in their classrooms. And so community partnerships can mean a lot of things. Sometimes that can be a donation, and I don't mind getting donations. But partnerships, as I look at them, are two-way streets. That's a situation where the partner sees students as an asset, and the students see the partner as an asset and contributing to them. This works best when this happens. Think about some places in your community that you could help solve problems for. you're a high school English teacher, if you're a middle school science teacher, if you're a fifth grade social studies teacher, doesn't really matter. There are problems in your community. There are challenges in your community. And if those organizations can use the wisdom of kids, the solution-making power of kids, that is a robust community partnership. And then on the flip side of that, you can get other adults to speak as experts. You can get other adults to mentor and support. You can get other adults to surround your students. That builds a healthy culture. That builds a healthy community when everyone is helping each other as it goes. So just continuing to utilize all your resources. You can see I'm here in St. Louis. I got the arch there, the moon's in the background. But I realized as a principal that my community here in St. Louis had so much to offer. I realized the St. Louis Federal Reserve had amazing lessons on economics. I realized the Missouri Botanical Gardens had amazing things about environment, flowers, fauna, the history of Missourian plants and native species and invasive species. The list goes on. We have a ton of community resources that can supplement your curriculum and the learning that your kids are doing. Also, our kids need varied voices. And I know that there are kids that if they listen to my math lecture versus go on YouTube and listen to the same math lecture, different things are going to resonate for different kids. So how do we use all adult voices to kind of surround our kids in this unique time? So one of the things you can do after this webinar is make a list. And maybe you won't utilize all these community partners on day one or in semester one, but who are 10 community partners that could supplement you as a teacher? Not take your place, not overrule you, not be the expert in your classroom, but could supplement you in what you were doing. I love that I went to this school in Delaware. Discover Card is a big moment there, but they had their Discover Mentor Room where folks from Discover would come, meet with kids, work with kids, read to kids, support kids. How do we continue to think about that not only in a face-to-face setting, but in a virtual setting? Could you have adults and parents checking in on some of your kids, having office hours with your kids safely and securely? What other adults can surround your students, especially in this extreme time of need? All right, just a few more. So we've got about 10 more minutes here, and just excited to keep sharing. These are ideas that I'm seeing work in other places, that they worked before. I think they work in this environment as well, and that's why I'm bringing them forward. But we talked about building community and culture. I think we talked a little bit about community partnerships, but then also how do we deepen collaboration? I think this has been a struggle. You know, I talk to my daughters and they really feel like they're on an island doing their learning. They don't feel like they're in that pot of four where they have a shoulder partner and a face partner, and they don't feel like they can get up and do cooperative learning structures. And they really do, as much as they say they don't, like that part of the collaborative process of learning. We also know that this is an important skill that all of a sudden when we're remote, in our house, in our basement, we don't feel like we're collaborating with others. We might have collaborative documents. We might have a Zoom call that feels like collaboration, but we need to figure out how to continue to do that. So there are a number of technology tools, and I'm not going to go into a list of technology tools, but this is where I think the use of technology. And now a caveat to that. I've spent the last 3 months trying to find hotspots and devices for families that don't have them. So I get that we have to think about the equity issues of technology as I answer this question with technology as the solution. But there are a number of technology tools that allow our kids to collaborate. And I think we can think beyond a Google Doc or a Microsoft 365 collaborative OneNote folder, whatever we're looking at. I think that there are ways that we can have kids comment, record, share, push to a larger audience. And I think it's important now more than ever that kids feel like they're working on projects together and getting those to a larger audience. because just saying I read this and I finished this and I finished this and I finished this feels like a checkbox way of learning and doesn't feel collaborative in nature. So what can you do to plan something that's experiential, something that really promotes kids slowing down and noticing? And then how can we make sure that kids are doing that together? Because a part of why we have our formal system of learning is that together, learning is more joyful and learning is more engaging. And so I think it's important that we find all of those technology resources that we can do. And one of the places I point to when I think about this is citizen science. If you're not familiar with the citizen science concept, there are numbers of studies going on all around the world that us as citizens can contribute to. We can go collect data and be a part of something bigger. I think that that might be a solution to part of our work. How can we get all of our kids contributing to this big, hairy problem and working towards a solution? You could just do that. You could get your kids involved in a citizen science project where they're studying what's going on, where they're looking at leaves, where they're looking at what's going on in their neighborhood, that they're counting transportation patterns, that they're paying attention to temperature and weather. If you search for citizen science, you'll see a number of projects out there. But even if you're not in the science realm, you can model that type of us gathering data for something bigger. That is one of those things that brings relevance. And I think is really important as we talk about this kind of pandemic learning that's going to vary and have uncertainty as a part of it, that how can we make sure that kids are collaborating in a safe way, especially that can be also in our classrooms where we're talking about keeping kids at distance and keeping collaboration harder than ever to be huddled around a table or scrolling on a whiteboard together. So I think it's important that we're thinking about all of those factors. Couple final things here. This one has been a problem for a long time, right? We've known for a long time that we have a need to right size our curriculum. We know that our current curriculum documents are bloated. We know that they need a greater level of precision, that we can't teach everything that's in our curriculum document at the depth that it needs to be taught in these conditions. So how can we have an important and needed conversation about right-sizing our curriculum going forward? This doesn't mean you're not teaching the standards, doesn't mean that you're not following the rules, but it is a sense that we're starting to look in a more precise way how long we teach all of those standards, at what level we surround those standards with activities and projects. So as we think about a new normal, not only urgent in the next 6 months, but forever, how can we right-size curriculum so that kids can go deep, have a time to collaborate, and experience the learning that they're trying to do? I think that we as teachers can do this on our own, but it's more powerful when we do it as a group and we come to consensus around, hey, here are the things that matter as a first degree mattering, a second degree mattering, a third degree matter. Here are the first things that we should make sure we touch on. Here's the things that we should make sure we go into some detail about. And then here are the things that we should go into depth about. And if we're not already doing that, I know some schools did this in March, and April, and May, and June. But if we haven't already done that, we really need to go and dig into those documents right now so that we don't get caught in the trap of just following the same sequence that we followed prior to all of this happening. And then the question that comes up is, what is truly essential? What is nice to learn? What's needed to learn? And what's necessary to learn? And finally, I think that we have a lot more resources in our schools than we let on. And one of those is our school librarians. And I know that there's a lot of worry and a lot of angst in our librarians right now, thinking about like, how am I going to disseminate books and who can touch them and how do we clean them and how is my space going to be used? But librarians have a knack for being flexible and agile, bringing fresh ideas to the table, being curators of resources. And I think now more than ever, we need those traits. Person that can be flexible, person that can work side by side and be agile with the teacher and help them out, to curate, to make sure they find new ideas and bring them to the table. And the other thing is I'm seeing so many amazing art teachers and music teachers and physical education teachers doing some really, really amazing things to keep kids engaged and joyful in their learning beyond the classroom. There's a lot to be learned there. So just an encouragement. I know that many of our schools have really high functioning PLCs and have really high functioning groups that work vertically across grade levels. But now's the time more than ever to get on calls with your colleagues, not just your group alike colleagues, not all the third grade teachers and not all the math teachers and not all the eighth grade team teachers. You need those conversations too. But it's a good time to bust down the silos and get some different ideas and get some different perspectives. We're going to need to lean on each other in a deep way as we kind of go through this next chunk of time. So just incredibly helpful to break down silos and kind of work with your librarians. Even thinking about how do you arrange space, I think, is an important thing. And then as we do this, let's continue to capture what works. I think the only reason I'm able to speak to you today is that I'm watching districts and schools and what's been working and what hasn't been working for them. And we have to not keep doing the same wrong things that we know didn't work somewhere else. So let's learn from our mistakes. Let's learn from the mistakes of others. Let's amplify and celebrate what works, because we're going to need that positive energy in a time that's going to be hard and exhausting. So I would just be an encouragement. If you heard one thing here, if you heard two things here that you can start with, write some things down. Because sometimes if you write them down, you hold yourself accountable. Or go record yourself saying, I'm going to do this. But for me, the thing that holds me accountable to doing something with these 9 ideas is to share them with someone else. And to say, hey, I heard this the other day. What do you think about this? And open up that conversation with your colleagues as a way to continue to lean in to providing for what's best for our students. I thank you for joining me today, recognizing that we all need a break. We all need ideas. We all need inspiration. And I hope that I'm able to bring a few of those things to you. Not every one of these ideas is going to work in every space. Not everything that we talked about today is even going to be possible because of the limitations of the pandemic. But I do believe that if we start to think about these 9 key concepts that go beyond health, but go to the humanity of learning, that we'll have an opportunity for our new normal on the backside of the pandemic to be more robust, more effective, and meet the needs of more kids. And certainly that's why we're in this. So to each of you, if I can be a resource to you, if I can help you in any way, there's my email at the bottom. Please send me an email. I want our teaching core in the United States to remain healthy and happy and effective with our kids going forward. And I know it's going to take us working together for that to be a really deep possibility. So thank you all. And I look forward to being a part and supporting all of you as we go forward.